Jody, no, you're not, sorry.
Hi.
Why don't you go ahead and do a quick introduction of yourself?
Well, I first want to mention that I'm wearing some thrift store items as we speak. Thrift store shopping is a great way to support your local nonprofits. My full name now is Jody Peterson Stigers because I'm a legally married woman. I'm the executive director of Interfaith Sanctuary Shelter. And do you want me to give a history of... So, how many of you are aware of Interfaith Sanctuary? Okay, so I don't have to go too deep. It's a shelter that serves anyone, no matter your race, your religion, your sexual gender, your ability to be clean and sober. It doesn't matter as long as you can just live by our behavioral code, which is to treat everyone with dignity and respect and to make everyone feel safe. And we have single adults that live on one side of our shelter. So we have a women's dorm and a men's dorm. And then on the other side of our shelter, we keep families intact. And however you make up your family, whether it's a mom and kids, a grandma, a mom and mom, whatever, we believe families should stay together. And we provide services for each of the groups that live inside of our shelter.
So how is Interfaith Sanctuary different?
Well, I think, first of all, we're super optimistic as a homeless shelter, and we're also extremely solution-based. We have amazing partnerships like B and like Jennifer and so many others where we're able to bring solutions directly to our guests, but first our guests have to teach us what solutions we need to bring to them. And the amazing thing that we find is that if we establish what the need is, if we call out to this community, we will always get help, and we will always be able to move someone forward because of, I think, specifically Boise.
So you just said something really interesting, and I think it goes back to what Brett shared with us, that our perception of what people need and what people need are frequently not the same thing.
That is so true. I have such an interesting side story. May I share it? Okay, so one of my goals as the executive director is to try and find a way to redefine my homeless population, because what many people don't know is that we have so many people who are full-time employed living in our shelter because there is no access to housing. There just isn't right now. And so they're stuck, and every morning they wake up and they go to work, but they're branded as homeless. Their ability to move up and get a better paying job, it's really hard to do when you have no address. Your ability to get housing when you have, so it's a struggle. And our timelines are so much longer now. People are staying in our shelter for 1.5 years because the housing programs that exist, there's no access to actually having inventory. And so my big dream is to try and create like this new campus for our homeless population where we'd have an emergency shelter, but we'd also build like this dorm where once you're engaged in programming, you're employed, you're getting moving forward, you get a room and you get an address. And that way, we're elevating you and you can no longer call this person homeless, they're now housed. And so I went and I looked at this, this building that came available, and it's huge. It's 60,000 square feet, it's super safe, it's tucked away. It could provide emergency shelter and private rooms. It had a railway on one side, a canal on the other, and so really we could secure it, because one of the issues of being downtown is our vulnerable population gets preyed on a lot. And I'm like, this is awesome. So I went back, and as I always do, I met with a group of my guests to say, what would you think about us moving to this building? I would have to raise a lot of money first, but what are your thoughts? And I explained everything, and all of them said, no way. And I said, but there would be a very good chance that you could have your own room. And they said, I know, but we would lose access to the downtown Boise library. They don't need a room as much as they need their safe spaces. They don't want to create a new culture someplace else because it's so hard to be accepted anyways. One of the guests went so far as to say, I am not going into a branch library, Jody. But it's like, I imagined that I had this huge responsibility to create a whole new world for our homeless population, And I've been working on it for like a year, and now I've completely regrouped, and I've got to find how to do housing in the downtown core, because this is where they feel safe and this is where they have their resources.
So, but the easier thing to do is just tell people how to do it. That we're going to solve your problem by doing X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I don't know if that works for anyone else, but it certainly doesn't work for the population we serve. We do a really good job because we actually find out what they need. Once we are able to start it, we establish a relationship, we establish trust, and we find out what their most basic needs are, and we give them some time. That reduces their trauma. And trauma, there's not one person in my shelter that's not experiencing some level of trauma. However they got into homelessness, however long they've been in homelessness, we have to create safe space first and give them some time to, kind of get their head back together, and then we can really start addressing the major issues.
So let's talk about those major issues, because Brett shared a story that kind of relates to that from the discussions we've had with Jennifer in the past. I mean, it's significant emotional problems, substance abuse, trauma in their lives, a variety of things that we have to address first before we can really address the issue of housing, correct?
Correct, and it turns out I have another really good story. But one thing I think that's important and that we've learned in the last year and a half, the studies show that trauma is first, and then mental health and addiction follows. So if we're not addressing the trauma and getting them to a place where they can feel safe, then you can't address the mental health and you can't address the addiction. You have to take each of those in their own right, and you have to really respect the fact that the trauma needs to settle down first before anything else. And so a great example of this is we started this pilot program called Project Wellbeing. I think I've talked to you about this. We identified 12 guests who have been in our system for a very long time, and clearly they had untreated mental health issues. So the way they were utilizing the system was every night they'd come and sleep with us. The next morning they'd get up, they weren't attached to services, they didn't meet with our case managers, they just went and survived on the street all day, which it's not easy to be homeless in the streets of downtown Boise. It's not. You have to keep moving. You have to know where your safe spaces are. You have to figure out how you're going to get your food. Whatever you need to support your own personal needs and habits, that happens all day long. And then you come back to the shelter, you're exhausted, and you're not going to really do much to move forward. So we identified 12 guests that we knew were caught in this cycle, and we invited them back into our shelter for this programming that was basically Monday through Friday. They got to stay in our shelter all day long. And we did breakfast, we did dream boards, we did creative writing, arts and crafts. We brought guest speakers in, we took them on field trips, we took them to the Boise Baroque rehearsal before their big first performance. They were getting exposed to all these things, but the most important thing was they got to be in the shelter all day. We created their structure. They never had to wonder what they were going to do hour by hour. And this was like a 90-day pilot project, right? After 30 days, these people were completely different human beings. They were so connected. They started being great communicators inside the shelter, recruiting people to get their mental health on track. They started writing a newsletter, and we now have a newspaper that is written by this group of 12. 90 days later, where we're looking at this program, 6 of those original 12 are employed, and 5 are moving out of our shelter at the end of this month. And these were people that everyone gave up on. And so the lesson of holding space for them and reducing the trauma, they started to tell us what they needed. We didn't ever push anything on them. We just gave them safe options, and it was so telling. And it's definitely, it motivates me for every human being that walks into my shelter now. I'm gonna find their safety first, and then we're gonna see what their potential is. Because everyone's got it, we just don't know how far it's buried.
And that I think is the really critical point, is that we are doing things a little bit different here in Boise than other places. I think we're doing that because we're blessed with the fact we don't have as daunting a situation as you may find in San Francisco or Los Angeles or even Salt Lake. But I think it's also a testament to the fact that we have a variety of different service providers that are far more flexible in their ability to deliver services than the traditional way. We share with us a little bit about how Interfaith Sanctuary's approach to housing has changed and the limitations of public support and public financial support and resources in this market? Because I don't think people appreciate how difficult it can be to get some of these marginal populations even public help through the programs that exist.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's scant inventory. It's, so many of the properties have flipped from affordable to take care of a population who's moving in who can afford higher rents. The new population in our shelter were housed, but their rents were increased to a point that unhoused them. And so you're seeing this new population learning to be homeless because they have that 30 days to be notified that this rent increase is happening. More than likely, they're not going to be able to meet that. They know that. So then they go and they search for another affordable option. There is no other affordable option. And so the employment becomes a risk. The transportation becomes a risk. It turns their world completely upside down. They have children who are in specific schools, and none of that is protected. And so they finally end up at our shelter, which I have to tell you, I love my shelter. I love my guests. I'm super comfortable there, but I've been working with this population for 14 years. When you are new to homelessness, that is one scary undertaking. That is why sometimes you'll see people choosing to sleep outside or in a car first because they're scared to take that first step into a shelter and be homeless. But the reality is we need to get more space. We are making more homeless people because we're not creating equal amounts of different kinds of housing. We're not being innovative in how we're putting people into housing. We need to really look at the different pods of people, how they need to live and how they work, and create housing for all of them. And there's ways for it to be good for everyone. There is. I know a lot of ideas. I won't give them to you all right now, but there are ways to do this.
Now, one of the things that I think we've done a better job in recent years in this community is the cooperation amongst various service providers. Can you share a little bit for our group about the intake process that you go through and how that integrates with other service providers?
Yeah, so New Path, we have a lot of paths in our business, but New Path is basically coordinated entry. This was a system that was put in place a couple of years ago that anyone who's entering into the homeless system does an intake with New Path. And their vital information goes in and it identifies what housing they may qualify for. What it also does is it constantly updates who our most vulnerable homeless people are on that day in that system. So different housing vouchers qualify if you're a vet, if you're a family with children, if you're a man 25 to 36, like it depends on how these vouchers have been identified. So now everyone's kind of in this system and they're able to be contacted when something becomes available. The sad part of coordinated entry is it would be super cool if there was inventory for every person that's in that system. Now it's just a bottleneck. Now it's just a bunch of people being put into a system and there's not a lot of movement at all. But it does help to know who's out there. It can help when you're looking at development. Who are we trying to house? How many people? How many families? What kind of workforce need is there? I think that's really important with that.
So when we talk about housing types, I think you hit the nail right on the head, is that there are a diversity of housing types that are needed. What is the most critical need and what would be in your mind, the most beneficial thing that we could do, right now in the next 6 to 12 months on the issue of housing in this community?
Okay, I have the whole thing mapped out. I think together, like literally you guys, we could totally do this together. We have to find a building that already exists, or someone has to give us some free land, and we need to build college dorms that have communal dining areas and shared bathroom spaces, but that there's quads that have 4 bedrooms in each unit, and some are distinguished for families, and some are actually for maybe some higher need, like mental health or medical. But we need to create something that's not relying on building a whole unit that's expensive. A lot of our homeless people do not need their own kitchen. They really aren't even equipped yet to be able to go shopping, to buy groceries, to drive to a market. But they are able to live and get support. So let's get them housed first so that they can get into real housing, but let's give them a room and an address and a place to store their stuff, because right now when you're homeless, you have to take all your stuff with you every day. We have lockers where you can keep some of your stuff, but what a pain, and how hard is it to be mobile and to get to job interviews and to feel nice when you can't even hang your stuff up. Everything's stuffed in a backpack. We need to build rooms for people and then continue to provide resources and programming until they can get out on their own. But this is a great stepping stone. I don't have a strong opinion about it, though.
Let's talk about barriers to employment, because there are a lot of your guests that I think are ready, willing, and able to be employed to the extent they can, but there are a variety of issues like identification and transportation.
Yeah.
And scheduling.
Yeah. Well, one of the number one reasons, actually, let's go to the prison system really quick, shall we? Because a lot of people who are homeless were at some point in the prison system. And amazingly, when someone has done their hard time and they're released back onto the streets and they're like, now go perform well and get a job and don't come back, and they send them out with no state identification. And so not one of them can ask for a job from any of you. They can't get housing. They can't get a state ID because they have no photo ID. And so they all end up at my shelter. And we have to fight super hard to get the documentation to replace people's identities. And we've done 110 ID replacements in the last 3 months, where we actually take them to the DMV after our case managers work to get birth certificates and other. It varies depending on how disconnected someone is from their community. Not everyone has a senior picture if they need a photo exception. There's rich histories before they got to us.
If you haven't taken the opportunity, go Google Jody Peterson TEDx, and it's getting ID in 15 steps.
15 crazy steps.
And you will come to appreciate the failures that we set people up for with the expectations that they go and sin no more.
Yeah.
And it's a compelling story. Now, as I understand it, as Jennifer shared, I mean, you had a recent success story again with somebody that did hard time, who saw your TED Talk.
Yeah.
And is a productive member of this community now. Can you share that?
I would be honored to. So there was a gentleman who was a lifer in a state prison in Mule Creek, California. And he had been sent to prison for 16 armed robberies. He started off life very rough. This is definitely the definition of trauma, what B was talking about. This man did not survive any of it, because he ended up on the course where he was in prison, using drugs in prison, got 2 other charges against him in prison, which made him become a lifetime prisoner. And 10 years into his incarceration, he found recovery. He started working really hard. He started going to groups. And at 50, he got his GED. And then he got his associate's degree. And then he got his bachelor's degree, all while he was in prison. And he also got employed at the highest level for a prisoner. And people started to take notice of him, and so a professor from Stanford wrote a note to a few judges to say, you need to take a look at this man. I think he's rehabilitated. And the judge one day called him into court, and his life sentence was overturned that day. And he went from being in prison for 26 and a half years to being a free man. And he got in the car to drive to Idaho, where his wife lives, with no ID. And he was prepared to like give back to the community. He was ready to make good now that he had gotten outside and he had the tools. He could not get an ID. He was trying everything. He gathered every kind of piece of paper you could get without a photo ID. He had a friend who sent him my TED Talk. And he watched the TED Talk and he sent me an email through my website and said, do you think you could help me? And of course I said, I would like to. And we did. We figured out a way to break into the system by confirming through the California Department of Corrections with the Idaho Department of Corrections. We got this man verified. He had so much documentation that the day we went to the DMV, he got a star card. That in itself is a victory. So he gets his star card, then he studies for his driver's test, and he passes. And this man has not been outside in 26 and a half years, and he's got what he needs now to be productive. So he starts sending out resumes and filling out online applications, and he's got his stack of bio information and these reference letters. No one will call him back. No one will grant him an interview because he has to check the felony box, right? So it's just assumed like, this guy's a felon, he's too dangerous, right? So he finally sends me a text and he's like, look, I don't know what to do. I really want to get back to work. Would you just hire me for free at Interfaith? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to hire you for free. Come and interview and we'll see what we can do. And he comes dressed in this suit with this beautiful package of information telling us all his work experience in prison. And we're like, I think this counts for something. And we gave him a job as an assistant to our facilities director. And he was so grateful and he did that job so well. The guests recognized something about him, and he really did put magic in our shelter. Our staffs are they're touched by him too. We decided to start this recovery program inside the shelter because we're having a lot of issues with people getting medically detoxed and being thrown out onto the street with no support. And so we're now doing in-treatment. And when he heard about that, he called and scheduled an interview with me to see if I would be willing to talk to him about him being part of Project Recovery. And he showed back up in my office in a suit, and he had this big proposal about how he wanted to be a peer support specialist, which is a mentor. A mentor is someone that goes through training, but you have to have gone through recovery because your experience actually is part of your training. And so he said, if I can do this, would you be willing to let me work at Project Recovery? And I'm like, absolutely. So he went to the course, it was 7 days, and he got a 96% on his exit exam. He's now the supervisor of Project Recovery. He's magic. He's unbelievable, and I sit in on some of his groups and stuff. It's unbelievable, really and truly. And the thing is, here's the thing, is that easy lives don't create interesting character, right? Like, I had a pretty easy life. I grew up in a beautiful family. I went to college. I got some jobs. Whatever. Like I've gotten character later in life, just from life happening. But this man, he has so much character and so much tenacity and so much heart. And I think that's the story of a lot of people who have to climb way back up again, right? I think that that's the best employee you can have. And I think that if you ignore the check and you actually sit across like you did and get the story, you might very well be sitting next to your best employee ever because they will be so much more grateful for the opportunity. And I mean, that's what he's taught me, is that I thought I was giving him a second chance. What he has given to us is so much bigger.
Well, Jody, I appreciate your passion. I appreciate all you do. We are so grateful to have somebody with the vision that you have here in our community. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is invite B and Josh to come back up. Because Josh still here? Did he walk out the door? Oh, he's there.
He's hiding.
Because we're gonna let you all ask some questions. I know there are questions that people have had, but